Deputy from District 18.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, to debate against the bill.
The floor.
Well, I've been very frustrated by this characterization of the bill as some means of protecting rural voters. If we made a rule in here that you can't pass a bill unless you have representatives from all 35 districts voting for it, nobody would say, wow, what a great way to protect rural voters. You would say, wow, you're trying to grind the legislative process to a halt, and you'd be right. And the same principle applies on ballot initiatives. You know, there has been this principle of equal footing, and, you know, the ballot initiative process is subject to the same processes in many ways as the legislative process. They are confined to the single subject rule. Now they have to have fiscal notes. This is such a stark departure from the principle of equal footing. We don't need support from all 35 districts in here. I really wish we did most of the time, but we don't. And there is absolutely no reason why we should put this incredibly stifling restriction when it's the people trying to pass a bill. Now, I want to be clear. It will not be practically possible to get citizen-driven ballot initiatives on the ballot if this law goes into effect. And I know there are going to be some people stand up and say, oh, sure it will. Well, I'd like to hear from the people that are not the armchair athletes. I would like to hear from people who have actually collected ballots. I would love to hear from somebody in here who has actually collected signatures for a ballot initiative stand up and say, no problemo. We can absolutely get something on the ballot under these rules. Because you can't. You can't. I've done it. I've been out there. I've collected hundreds and hundreds of signatures. It's insanely hard and time consuming. I worked somewhat on the Medicaid expansion signature collection, and I want to tell you, I believe that that represents the outer bounds of what is possible under a citizen-driven ballot initiative. Now, you know, I understand with $8 million, you can buy your way onto the ballot. You can hire the people that it takes to get on the ballot. But I don't think that's how we want to confine our ballot initiatives. I don't think we want to cabin it back to something that only people with $8 million can buy their way into. This is something that's for the people, and it needs to be something that the people can reasonably access and implement. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how it went for Medicaid expansion. This was the biggest volunteer-driven thing I've ever seen in the state of Idaho. There was so much pent-up desire and frustration. For 7 years, the legislature had been refusing to hear or allow a vote on it. There were thousands of people all over the state who were so worked up. This was their #1 issue. It had been all over the news. People were out there morning, noon, and night. People were out there in casts on crutches collecting signatures. People were sitting in farmers markets day and night collecting every signature they could collect. People with cancer were leaving from their chemo appointments to go out in the streets to collect signatures for this ballot initiative. It was all hands on deck. I don't know that we're ever going to see anything like that again in the state of Idaho. But this astonishing record mass citizen undertaking would never have made it on the ballot if this had been in effect. They barely made it. I mean, the weekend before the deadline, they were flooding the place and really anxious about whether they were going to meet the standard under the current standard. There is no way it would have made the ballot under this 35 district rule. No way. And I don't think it's reasonable to expect anybody to mount a bigger effort than that. That's the biggest effort I've ever seen. And if that effort wouldn't make it under this standard, then this standard is not reasonably possible. And frankly, I think that makes it unconstitutional, because this is a right that's in our Constitution. And it has to be removed through our Constitution. You can't take a constitutional right away through statute, which is what this tries to do, by putting in so many practical barriers that it cannot be done. If you want to repeal it through the Constitution, go for it, put it on the ballot, see if the people of Idaho want to take away their own ballot initiative rights. I dare you. But unless you're going to proceed that way, trying to proceed through legislation is a totally inappropriate way to strip away a constitutional right. And to be clear, if Medicaid expansion had not made it on the ballot, the people suffering would have been the rural voters. This has nothing to do with protecting rural voters. It hurts rural voters. There were 9 rural districts who passed Medicaid expansion who did not qualify under the signature collection requirements. And they're the ones who would have suffered the most of all. They would have lost their hospitals. A big part of Medicaid expansion was to protect rural hospitals and cover their bills so they didn't go out of business. So if this had been on the books, it would have severely punished the rural voters of the state. So I'm very frustrated that this is being framed somehow as some pro-rural thing. It's not. So, we're already the hardest of any state. There are 26 states, I believe, that have ballot initiatives. When you take all the factors into account and the percentage and our signature screening mechanisms, we're already the hardest in America. This would put us off the charts, by far the hardest. And I certainly think in light of that it's, I think, likely to be struck down in court, but I'd rather not get to that point. Actually, the one silver lining from my perspective, and something you may want to keep in mind, is that if this goes to court, there's a pretty good question as to whether the 18 districts requirement is even legal, or whether that is too restrictive. So if you bring this to court, you may lose the 18 district requirement, which from my perspective would be fabulous, but I imagine for many of yours would not be. So be careful what hornet's nest you go kicking with this. But and certainly there is no state in the union that requires all legislative districts in order to certify something for the ballot. This is unheard of. There's no state that does anything like this. So I think, if y'all are afraid of what the people of Idaho want to do and what their agenda is, and you feel it's important to block that, you may be in the wrong line of work. I hope that nobody came to this building with the objective of preventing the people of Idaho from getting their wishes. But that is essentially what Senate Bill 1110 is here to do. It's to make it virtually impossible for the people of Idaho to have a voice and have the only mechanism they have to implement their wishes through law. So I strongly urge your red light on this.